I'm Alan Fueling, a co-organizer and host. West Orlando WordPress is an official WordPress meetup group and is affiliated with the main WordPress Orlando and WordCamp US meetup groups. Do you see caching as that vague and confusing thing that developers do to speed up your site? Maybe you've even gotten brave and tried installing and configuring a caching plugin. That reality is you are getting really sure how caching works, and it always seems to make things more complicated than they need to be. If this is you, you'll want to watch this whole presentation. Using simple analogies and unique visuals, you will come away with understanding how caching works, what types of cachings exist, and why you might use them. At the end of the presentation, you'll know how to avoid common pitfalls that DIY caching novices fall into. Tonight's presenter is Micah Wood, who has spoken at our Third Thursday meetups before. Micah is a WordPress developer at Bluehost, a professional WordPress developer for over a decade, and has worked on sites for Fortune 100 companies, has released over a dozen WordPress plugins, is a frequent speaker at WordCamps, co-organizes the WordPress Gwinnett meetup, and is a co-host on the WP Square One podcast, and shares his knowledge by teaching at SkillShare and blogging on WordPress development topics. At this point, I'd like everyone to mute their microphones for the presentation. Micah, thank you for being our presenter this evening. The time is now yours.
Hopefully you can see that. Like you said, I've been doing development for a long time. When I first started, I didn't know anything, and kind of then self-taught along the way, everything from how to code and how to deal with caching. Caching was kind of like one of those things that just you would get something working, and then somebody's like, well, I don't see that. And then next thing you know, like it all boils down to a caching problem. Something got cached, and so it was always kind of a tough thing initially to get my brain wrapped around. But yeah, so hopefully we'll expose a lot of the misconceptions and misconfigurations and those kinds of things in this talk. But yeah, so there's my Twitter handle, WP Scholar, and WPScholar.com is my website if you want to go check out any of the articles there. They're all development related. So we're going to take a look here at what is caching. So this is kind of the most succinct version, I guess, of a definition that I came across that makes sense, right? So it's basically just temporarily storing something so that you don't have to do the work again later. So kind of like in math, for example, if you you've got this big long equation to figure out, and you jot the answer down, and next time someone presents that problem, if you've already got the answer, you don't have to do all the work, right? So that's kind of the idea here. So in more simpler terms, I like to make myself an omelet every morning for breakfast, and so anytime I want to do that, obviously I need eggs to do that. So I go to the fridge, grab out 3 eggs, make my omelet, and that's that. But that is a form of caching, right? So I have cached the eggs in the refrigerator, and I do not have to go to the grocery store every morning to get my eggs, or I don't have to go, scare them out of chickens or anything like that. So once you kind of get a general feel for what caching is, the next thing you have to realize is that there's something called cache invalidation. So, at some point, if we use the example of caching things in the fridge, so you've got your milk, you brought it from the store, you put it in the fridge, use it for a little while. And then at some point, some date in the future, this milk, if it's not used, is going to be bad. Now, as we all know, there's a lot of different ways that people like to check if the milk is good or not good. Some people don't check. Some people realize when it's already gone bad. So, usually they'll put the date on there when it expires, but, it depends on whether somebody left it out of the fridge for a while and put it back in, or how much light came into the container, that kind of stuff. So in much the same way when you're dealing with caching, there's a lot of different things that could cause data in the system or files that have been cached to kind of just expire. And sometimes it's because it hit the date, and other times it's because there was some other thing. It could be like some sort of memory limit, and now it's just dropping data every time something new comes in. So that's something to be aware of. So you can also manually purge caching. So these are a few examples of just little screen snippets from various different plugins and things that all handle caching. So you can manually say, okay, whatever's in the cache, I want to get rid of. So we've got, this is a spin up WP. They have a purge all caches. So they have an object cache, a page cache, and this is W3 total cache, and they have all their caches, and they have different modules that you can purge. And auto optimize is a little simpler. It just says delete. And there's some other just things out there. So you can always manually purge. So again, so you have a basic understanding of caching. So why do it? So there's some obvious reasons. I think the one that everyone probably does it for is just so that they'll have a faster website. It's what do they say? For every second that your page takes to load, you lose a pretty significant percentage of people who will actually stick around to look around in your site. So it's very close to the faster website, but essentially, if you can reduce the amount of resources that your website requires to run, then you're reducing the amount of resources that the server needs, and therefore it can handle more traffic. So caching is great for that. The server doesn't have to do all that work every time. And of course, we know that Google and other search engines, they use the speed of your site as kind of a ranking. I think there's 200 different ranking factors, but site speed is one of those, and it's pretty important. Again, because it's all directly related to the user experience. So if a user comes to your site and they have to wait 10 seconds or 30 seconds for your page to load, or something gets cached and things break, they're not likely to stick around and try to figure it out. As a technical person, I always like to stick around and try to figure out why somebody's thing is broken. But most people, they just leave, go to the next search result in Google, and carry on with their day. So there's a few different types of caching. And so this is kind of one of the more important things that you want to make sure you understand, is that there's not one type of caching. So if we say caching, I think most people think that there's just this one magical silver bullet that's doing all the things that is just named caching, which is not true. So there's a bunch of different kinds. So this is, we'll start with the CDN. You've probably heard the term CDN. It stands for Content Delivery Network. And so this is essentially doing nothing more than storing files. It's much like me taking eggs from the grocery store and putting them in my fridge so that they're close when I need them. CDN, all it does is it says, okay, so your website's hosted in Atlanta, but somebody in Beijing wants to access it. So we're going to take some files and we're going to store them near Beijing. And so when this person goes to your website, instead of having to go halfway around the world to get the files, they're locally stored somewhere on a server. So that's basically what a CDN is. It just stores the files at a closer location, and often at many locations around the world, so that anybody who goes to your site, they can get those files faster. So then we have what's called the browser cache. So every website you go to is you have to go to it in a browser. And so usually there's some sort of rules that are sent from the website saying, hey, you know, cache this page or well, not so much page per se, but like cache this image, cache the styling for this page, cache this, that, and the other. And so the browser will take those kind of rules or commands or suggestions and store those in your browser cache, which is essentially just a place on your computer. So, so the whole idea of clearing your browser cache is actually just clearing files off of your computer that are stored there, so that if you visit subsequent pages, you know, maybe like a key file that's used on multiple pages, you don't have to load that from the server every time. It's just right there and ready to go. So then we have something called an object cache. An object cache is, I like to tell people just to think of it as like a data cache. So if you have, again, this is probably more like, let's say math, right? So let's say if the computer is asked to do some big math problem, and then, you know, so you make a request and you say, hey, do this math. And the computer does the math and comes back with a solution. Data or object cache would say, okay, let's store the result. So the next person asks the same question, it's going to get the same result. And we don't have to do all the work again. So that's kind of the idea of that. Now, you know, obviously it's not always math. Math's just a good example, but there's a lot of, you know, requests that happen where there's just tons of work that needs to be done on the server side. Maybe we've got to make a whole bunch of queries to the database and pull all the data together and piece it together in a way that is usable, and then send it back to the user. So if we cache that into object cache, no need to do that work again for the next time, until of course the cache is invalidated or expires, in which case the next request that comes in, they're going to do the work again and then save it. And that's kind of how the cache stays up to date. We also have something called page cache. So this is where you actually cache an entire web page, right? So you go to the browser, you load up a page, and that entire web page has to be created kind of on the fly by the web server. So again, you know, we're running code that's piecing together the HTML and the images and all the things that make up the page. And instead of having to do that work again, we're just going to say, hey, we built this page. Here it is in its raw form that we can just send to the browser. Let's just cache it and save it there. So that's what the page cache is. So let's see. So we're going to run through a few best practices here. So so first thing to realize is that caching is an enhancement. It is not something you want to implement until your site is ready to launch. You don't want to start trying to set up caching while you're also building the site. So it's an enhancement. It's going to give you a lot better performance. So try to make sure you think of it as an enhancement, not a must always be there. There will be times where caching just won't work for particular scenarios, and that's okay. So caches have limits. You cannot cache everything all the time. I did not know this initially when I was doing some caching. So I had a site, and we were making lots of requests to some external service, and in order to prevent having to make requests back every time, we were caching the results of that. So we were using something called object cache, which is the data cache. And the problem was that the particular cache that we were using had a memory limit. So you could only store like 2 megabytes of data in this. And since, you know, you're just storing kind of raw data, it doesn't really take up a whole lot of space. But if you try to cache everything that happens on the website, then that 2 megabytes is going to fill up pretty quick. And then what's going to happen is every time something new comes in, it says, oh, let's hit the cache. If it's there, great. But if it's not, it's going to cache that thing, and then it's going to have to kick something else out in order to keep from it can't overfill the memory. It can only store so much data. So it's going to start pushing things out as new things come in. So it's important to understand that you can't go overboard on it. And so, yeah, the big trade-off that everyone has to kind of make a decision on is at what point is what I'm caching, where is performance and data freshness on this spectrum? So you can make something super fast, but usually it requires caching it for longer periods of time, right? So if I say, okay, I've got this page and I want to cache it for a day. So by tomorrow, it'll refresh. So any data that may have updated, particularly on that page, within that 24 hours isn't going to show up until the next day. So that's, we said, okay, well, we are willing to sacrifice that day's worth of fresh data for this level of performance. And as you kind of move up and down that scale, you say, okay, well, we can do better if we cache it for a week. Well, now the data is even more stale come 7 days later. And sometimes you say, oh, well, this data is every 60 seconds we need fresh data. So then you're really sacrificing a lot of performance, because then every 60 seconds, if somebody new comes to site, we're gonna have to redo the work and figure out what data we need to show them. So there's always a trade-off, and you usually can create the rules that you need with different plugins to kind of find that balance and say, well, I only want to cache this for X amount of time because this data, we just can't have it go stale, or we can cache some things you can cache for a year, like images, for example. It's on the site, image is not going to change, let's cache it for a year. So the other thing is we don't want to cache any dynamic content. So this can lead to what we call a data leak. So just as an example, I was implementing cache on one site, and so I was logged in, I did all the configuration, went to the front end while I was logged in, and I viewed the page. But of course, you get the little WordPress admin bar at the top when you're logged in. And so, I saw that there. I was like, okay, that's great. So then I had a friend pull up the site, and they pulled it up, and we were screen sharing, I think. And then I saw the admin bar at the top of the page, and they were not logged in. And then I noticed that my photo was also in the top right corner. So it had cached my logged in state in this particular scenario. So which that's not the end of the world. Somebody sees a little tiny picture of you, but where it really does matter is if you have like an e-commerce site and someone goes to the checkout page and fills out a form and types all their information in, or and then goes to another page and it has all the details of their order and their address and their name and their phone number and the last four of their credit card and all that shows up on a screen. Well, if that got cached and the next person who checked out and went to the order confirmation and got a cached version of the last person's order, that's a bit more sensitive. So we got to be real careful that if there's some sort of dynamic content, particularly sensitive personal data, we don't want those pages cached. So I think most caching plugins, they're going to say, if you're using something like WooCommerce or Easy Digital Downloads or some of those plugins, it's not going to cache those, order checkout pages for that reason. So one of the other things we don't want to do is use more than one of the same type of caching. So as we've discussed, we've got our object cache, we've got our page cache, we've got browser cache, we've got all these different caches. And it's important to understand that if you have your web host hosted somewhere, it's very likely that the web host has available some sort of caching built in on the server. And then, you may have some plugins that do caching. And sometimes there's plugins that actually do their own caching as well. But for example, if your web host caches a full page, and then you have a plugin that also caches a full page, and let's say that should refresh every, I don't know, 15 minutes. So let's say the web host is taking care of it, and every 15 minutes that page is going to refresh. Well, this over here says, oh, well, every hour we'll refresh it. And so then what you end up with is, a site that's cached, and then the cache that's caching the other cache. And so it extends the time of the cache, and then things can also get pretty wonky, especially when you start compounding things like object cache. Object cache can make your WordPress admin faster because all of the queries that happen in WordPress, all that's just stored, and you don't have to go fetch it again. The problem with that, though, is if you have multiple caching, object caching happening, then you could be pulling data, and again, caching the thing that's cached, or sometimes you might hit one cache, sometimes you might hit another cache. It really depends. So the most important thing is just, if you have, it's okay to have multiple caching plugins or a web host that does caching and run a caching plugin, but you just have to be aware of, like, okay, so if my web host has page caching, I don't need a plugin that also does page caching. If my web host does object caching, but they don't do page caching, then having a plugin that does page caching is fine. And then maybe having another plugin that does browser caching for your site is okay, as long as all of those things are separate. Now, most caching plugins try to do more than one type of caching. So it's important to be aware of what your web host does and what your caching plugins do, and make sure that you disable the thing that the web host is doing for you in the plugin, so that you don't end up with weird things happening. So typically, if you just Google the name of the plugin, the caching plugin you're using, and the name of the web host that you're using, you will find information about the types of caching and kind of how to configure and do that. So when we're talking about caching things, there's not just caching. There's some other kind of performance concepts that come into play. It's good to be aware of those. They're not exactly caching, but they're along similar lines. So we have something called minifying, which a lot of caching plugins will do. And so all that is if we've got a text document, and technically every web page is a text document. It also has another text document that dictates what the styling is, and a text document that dictates the page structure. And when you combine those two things in a browser, it gives you a visual representation of the website. So we can take some of these text documents, and we can say, okay, well, normally they're all nicely formatted so that the people who are coding the site can see, oh yeah, this is nicely indented, and I can make sense, and my brain can read this stuff. But the computer doesn't really care, right? So we can just mash it's like taking all the spaces and, if you took a Word document and you just deleted all the spaces between the words, that's basically what you get when you're minifying. So you're taking all the pages that are sent to the browser, mushing them together. And then we have something called concatenation, which is where if you do have multiple documents that need to be sent to the browser, why don't we attach multiple documents into one document? That way we just send one document instead of 10 or 15 or 30 documents. And so this is actually very common, and it can speed your site up significantly because there are CSS files which dictate the style, the look and feel of your site. And every plugin just about has a CSS file. So if you're running 50 plugins, you may have 50 CSS files that have to load so that the visitor to your site sees what they're meant to see. And then, of course, if your theme has a CSS file, and then all these things, it's not uncommon to see a site that has 25 to 50 CSS files that have to load for that a given page. And so concatenating is saying, hey, let's take all those CSS files, mash them in one. And so now instead of your browser, when it's trying to fetch the page, instead of it having to make 50 requests to get all of those things, it can just make the one request, and it's a lot faster. So then we have what's called compressing. And so we have all kinds of image formats and things that we use on the web. So there's JPEGs, PNGs, there's WebP, there's a bunch of other ones I forget the abbreviations for. There's lots of new ones that actually have come out recently as well. And so most image formats actually have some form of compression algorithm that they use to make the image as small as they can while not degrading the quality of the image. But at the same time, we can use compression to take a text file and it's kind of like zipping things, right? So if you have 40 files and they take up a gig, and you mash them all into a zip file, and now it's a half gig or something relatively smaller, right? So if we can compress a file and kind of zip it up and send it across the internet that way, and then unzip it on the other side, then we're sending less data, right? So instead of sending 3 megabytes of stuff, we're actually sending 1 megabyte, but it ends up being 3 megabytes once it gets to its destination. So that's basically what compression is, and it's important because it does make a huge performance improvement. So let's talk a little bit about implementation. So again, when we're talking caching, there's a lot of different ways that kind of comes out. So your web host is probably the first thing that you want to make sure you understand what types of caching that they provide. And, sometimes a web host might allow you to disable caching or, turn it off or whatnot. I know. So I work at Bluehost. And so we have built in a way for users to go in and just say, turn off caching. They've got a caching plugin. You can turn off the web hosting caching on Bluehost and just use something else. But maybe you don't have anything else and you want it on. So that choice is totally yours. But there's other web hosts that you'll go to and they don't give you a choice, right? They just do it by default. I think WP Engine does that. So you just need to understand what types of caching they have available. And I think WP Engine, like for example, with object caching, you have to go in and manually turn it on or disable it if you don't want it. So you just have to understand what's available and what you've got there. So here is actually the Bluehost screenshot from Bluehost, the Bluehost plugin, which allows the section here that allows you to manage caching. So it tells you, how long you're going to cache things, what types of things are going to be cached, and then you can just turn everything off. And it gives you a button here to clear the cache. So that just deletes everything out of the cache and starts fresh. So this is from Kinsta. So Kinsta has site caching built in, and you can enable, disable, clear, all those different kinds of things. As you can see, all the interfaces are going to be very different. So here's SiteGround. So they have a caching section under the speed item there, and then you can actually turn caching on and off for different sites that you might have on there, that kind of thing. So this is WP Engine. So again, here they have a whole page dedicated to, they have multiple cachings mechanisms that they use. So they got the page cache, they got the object cache, they got network caches, they got CDNs, all that kind of good stuff. And so you can go through and clear individual or turn on and turn off some of those things. So that's important if you're using WP Engine to know where that is. So that's just kind of a covering of some of the top web hosts and some of the caching stuff that they do. But Cloudflare, they actually provide an interesting service. They can do a lot of different things. You can get a free Cloudflare account, and it'll actually allow you to do page caching. It'll allow you to do set up rules for browser caching. It can help minify like JavaScript and CSS and a lot of those things, as well as it provides a CDN. But excuse me, need some water here. So the cool thing about Cloudflare is it's not a web host and it's not a plugin. So it actually can run external from your site. It can also help mitigate like issues with your site getting people running scripts on it, trying to test, see if they can hack your site, that kind of stuff. So it can stop a lot of that as well. So that's a good option if you're looking at some different things and maybe you don't want to run yet another plugin. You can get some of those things from Cloudflare. And matter of fact, a lot of web hosts actually will set up Cloudflare for you. I think Kinston now actually you just get Cloudflare by default, so you're technically getting it. And Bluehost even does the same thing. So, but yeah, so if you do set up an account and configure it, they have a section here where you can come in, you can purge the cache, and depending on what level, if you get the free plan, you get a certain amount of functionality, but if you pay for some of their higher level plans, you get more functionality, more features, obviously. So WP Rocket is, I would probably say it's one of the best caching plugins that you could probably use with WordPress, just because it is a paid WordPress plugin. But the reason I say that is because number one, they've done a really good job of making caching and setting caching up a very simple process, a lot less confusing. They don't give you as many options, but the options they give you are smart options. So for example, if I'm running particular plugins on my site, WP Rocket might say, oh, well, you should use this configuration or that configuration because we've detected this or that on your site. So it's smart in that way. And because it's a paid plugin, you also can just call somebody, well, maybe not call, but they have a support chat, email system that you can use to get support. So WP Rocket does, browser caching, gzip compression, minification, concatenation. They have CDN support, which I think you have to pay extra for. But yeah, it's just a really, really good tool. So here's a little screenshot of what it looks like to be using WP Rocket. So under your settings, you got WP Rocket there. I like the fact that they don't think they're super important and need a top level menu in your WordPress admin sidebar. They tuck themselves away under settings, which is nice and keeps your admin less cluttery. But yeah, so they've got all kinds of different caching options, as you can see here. So then there's another plugin. It's called Comet Cache. This is a paid plugin, and it has a good bit of advanced functionality. They've got page caching and compression and some of those things. So this is what it looks like to use Comet Cache. It's it's kind of their basic configuration is it's on, it's off, it's on, it's off. So if that's your level of desire for caching, then this might be a good plugin. I think they do have a more advanced section where you can do some more stuff, but so it's a decent plugin. Whoops. And then there's a plugin that's been popular for a very long time called W3 Total Cache, and it allows you to configure a whole bunch of stuff. And even if you're a lot of times with things like object caching, for example, you kind of have to have the server set up to handle that. So a lot of times you need your web host to do that for you. But W3 Total Cache actually kind of provides some like alternative ways of making that happen just on your file system. So that's kind of can be kind of interesting way of kind of getting around some limitations of maybe if your host doesn't provide object caching or something like that. So yeah, the problem with W3 Total Cache is that it has so many options that if you don't if you're not a relatively professional caching expert, you're not really going to have a clear idea of what you should be doing, what you should be turning off, and how this thing works, because there's just so much to it. So again, this is where I think WP Rocket comes out ahead. Is they can do a lot of the same things that this plugin does, but they just make it so much simpler and more easy to understand that you're not sitting there second guessing yourself every time you click a setting. So then there's something called Cache Enabler. This is a free plugin. And again, this one has pretty simple options. So, you know, it's definitely more user-friendly than W3 Total Cache, but, you know, kind of just your standard, you know, settings page in WordPress kind of thing. And then we have something called WP Optimize, which is, again, another free plugin. And it does some of these, you know, caching and compression and some of those kinds of things. But it also actually has some functionality, which most of these other plugins don't, where it'll actually do some database optimization. So typically when you're running a website, you know, your database is where all the data gets stored. And, you know, there's various things that you can do to clean your database up and, you know, can make things faster. You know, I don't know if you remember, it used to be we have to defragment our hard drives back when. So basically all the data, you know, you create something, you delete something, and all the data just kind of ends up everywhere. And then at some point, you know, if you can kind of put it all in one place, then the computer can read it faster. So that same kind of thing happens with database. And so there's some basic maintenance that most people don't do on their database that this tool would let you do. But yeah, this is a screenshot of their page caching section. And again, you know, turn it on, generate separate files for mobile, you know, relatively simple settings. So it's nice and easy to use. And so it's a good plugin if you're looking for something free. Auto Optimize is also a free plugin. I think I started using it just because of the concatenation. It did that pretty well. But yeah, it does a lot of, like, lazy loading is important. So when you load up a page, let's say you've got a gallery with 50 images on there, you know, that page isn't done loading until all 50 images are there, right? And so when Google goes to your page and says, oh, well, it took, you know, a minute to load your page, you know, your SEO is probably not going to do well. But if you can lazy load your images, then that's going to basically mean that the whole page will load, and the images that are visual, that are in the viewport, in the browser viewport, they'll show up. But everything else was just kind of going to get skipped until the user actually scrolls down, and then it'll load the images. So that way you can take a page that may actually take a minute for all those images to load, and you can reduce it down to like 10 seconds because it only has to load a handful of images up top, and then you know, and ideally you want your page to load in like 2 to 3 seconds, but the reality is, you know, something like that on an image heavy page can make a big difference. So this is Auto Optimize. So they've got options for kind of minimizing and optimizing JavaScript and CSS and your HTML, as well as like the lazy loading features that we were just talking about. Then there's WP Super Cache. This is actually created by Automatic, which is kind of, I always refer to Automatic as the company behind WordPress. So that's the company that Matt Mullenweg owns. That he's he and Mike Little were the guys that basically started WordPress. So this is again a nice little plugin, simple interface. So not too complicated, and it's, you know, again, backed by Automatic, so that's not too bad. And then there's some other plugins. So this isn't specifically a caching plugin, but Smush is one of those things that is a free plugin, and it will actually handle a lot of like lazy loading of images on your site, which again, so if you've got a slider with lots of images or image galleries, things like that, you'll definitely want to explore lazy loading, and Smush will actually allow you to do that automatically. And but its primary feature is to actually compress your images as much as possible. So a lot of times if you upload an image directly from, let's say you took a picture on your phone and you upload it on your website, that's usually a 7 megabyte image. We usually try to keep an entire web page down to less than 1 megabyte in general. So if you have a 7 megabyte image loading on a page, obviously you're kind of exceeding that. 2 megabytes is not unreasonable, but 7, if you have 2 images, then you're at 14. So that's kind of getting a little ridiculous. Now, nice thing is WordPress does automatically kind of take some different image sizes, and so you may not be loading the full size image. But if you were, you don't want to load a 7 megabyte image. So you can run it through Smush, and Smush will say, oh, okay, well, I can run this algorithm against it and compress it down to, maybe a meg or 400 kilobytes or whatever it is. Probably usually significantly less, something like in the neighborhood of 50 to 80% savings of the image, something like that. So that's a good plugin. Imagify, I guess that's how you say it, is also another great plugin. It is a paid plugin, but it works really well with WP Rocket. So this is the Smush dashboard. So they have like a bulk Smush. So if you install this plugin, every image that you upload to your site is automatically going to get compressed. But if you anything that was already there won't be unless you bulk Smush. The free plugin only lets you compress, I think, 50 images at a time. But if you pay for the upgrade, it'll let you just do it one click. Oh yeah, here we go. Imagify. So, it's a free WordPress plugin, but you have to pay for their service. So it's basically a paid thing. But yeah, it'll do the same thing as Smush. Any image that gets uploaded, it'll automatically compress it. And then it has a bulk tool that you can use to optimize all your existing stuff. And so this is what it looks like here as well. So again, I like it gets tucked under settings in WordPress and kind of helps prevent all the clutter of menu items. But they have kind of like normal, aggressive, and ultra, so you can kind of decide on how crazy you want to get with compressing your images. I've done ultra on most sites, and image sizes get reduced more than the aggressive setting. But in some cases, I have seen, particularly when you've got, I've seen some headshots of people where ultra kind of made their skin slightly different color. So you kind of have to play around on the site and see what you're getting. But the nice thing is you can always go back and if one image looks off and the rest of them look great, you can just go back and say, well, this one image, use aggressive, not ultra. And then it'll improve it because it keeps the original images, which is great. So these are some of the resources here. So there's some links. I probably need to share a link to this slide deck so you have access to these links. But there's a beginner's guide to word caching. Nice little article there. And then Page Speed Insights is a tool that helps you get a good picture. It's Google's tool. Gives you a good idea of how your site is doing right now, gives you kind of a score and tells you these are kinds of things that you need to do to improve your speed, and it prioritizes those things so that you kind of know where to focus next. Cloudflare, a great tool even if you don't use it for caching. Would highly recommend it. I think most people on most web hosts are probably starting to get it anyway. And then, Smush, Imagify, and then these are all the caching plugins I mentioned. So WP Rocket would be my primary suggestion for most people, unless you just really know what you're doing and you really want to get down into the weeds with W3 Total Cache. You can do that. But yeah, so that's kind of that's the presentation. I know a lot of you may have questions, so I guess we'll just open it up to questions now.
Thanks a lot, Micah. That was awesome. There's so many caching plugins out there that it's hard to, wrap your mind around all of them. But that was good to see kind of at least your recommended ones.
Yeah.
A couple that I like that you were talking about there was Comet Caching and WP Super Cache. It's just basically like you can just like turn it on and then see how it goes type of thing. You don't have to really configure anything, which I read about was like a, kind of the like basically the first step of your caching journey is just turn it on and see how it goes and then get in there and try to like customize all the settings and stuff like that. But I was reading up a little bit on that WP Super Cache because it is made by Automatic, which is the WordPress people. So there's lots of articles about them, and I didn't even realize it was a thing until I started kind of looking around, because I've been using WP Rocket myself on a lot of client websites just because it's got the support piece. It's like $49 a year, I think, for the plugin. But that support piece, if you're kind of doing this by yourself, it's like, okay, that's a good thing to have. You can ask them questions or just have them take a look at your stuff, and that's of course my recommendation too is go with WP Rocket if you got $49 a year, and you'll be happy because there's someone there out in the internet to help you out.
Yeah, because I guarantee you run into one issue and you think, oh, I need a developer, and then you pay easily $20 or more,
right?
Just for that one incident. And if you have paid $49 for a plugin, yeah, you're covered. So
yeah, that's awesome.